energy and how it flows through ecosystems. In this series of ecology videos, you're going to learn how to plan and carry out investigations that will analyze data that supports things affecting biodiversity and the population within inside ecosystems. We want to develop models and analyze how the cycling of matter and the cycling of energy within ecosystems processes different types of energy outcomes. We use photosynthesis and cellular respiration to describe this. We arrange components of food webs and other food chains to demonstrate energy flow. We also compare the quantity of energy and the steps of a pyramid to see how energy is passed on at different trophic levels. We explain the needs of different molecules like carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, and phosphorus. And then separately, we're going to talk about how humans impact the stability of these systems, because through environmental change, we want students to be able to design a solution that's going to reduce the human impact and human activity impact on our ecosystems. And by the end of ecology, students need to be able to explain or perhaps even predict how an organism's ability to survive within the changing limits of the world is even possible when changing temperatures or changing environmental factors like pH or a drought or a fire are presenting difficulty. So all energy on Earth comes from the sun, right? So how do we get that energy? There's lots of ways to get energy. Producers, though, those are also called autotrophs. They get energy from non-living sources. Most of them actually capture energy from the sun during photosynthesis to make simple sugars. Consumers, they can't photosynthesize. Those guys are also called heterotrophs, and they get energy from living or, well, once living things. Autotrophs are things like plants, trees. Consumers are things that usually eat autotrophs. So heterotrophs typically eat autotrophs like cows, and but also other consumers can be like us, like humans. You know, we get our source of energy from the living things that we eat that get energy from the sun. So producers get their energy, it's a source that's from the sunlight. Oh, I just messed that up. Yes, so the source of energy is sunlight, and those are things like plants. Oh, and even cyanobacteria, those are bacteria that photosynthesize. They're called blue-green algae. They'll even form like these mats on the surface of waters and produce like toxins that really make humans sick. Chemosynthesis is a little different strategy for a producer. Those guys are photosynthesizing technically, but they're using chemicals as their source of energy instead of sunlight. Chemicals like sulfur and methane, CH4. Those are things like very deep sea vent bacteria. So if you've ever seen Mysteries of the Deep, those vents that are in really, really deep within the ocean that are producing this gaseous, smoky stuff that looks like it's coming out of them, and there's like special worms that live there. It's using a sulfur or methane gas material that's coming from the center of the earth, and it's using that compound to chemically synthesize energy. So an example like that would be if we took carbon dioxide, CO2, and we used dihydrogen sulfide, H2S, in the presence of O2, oxygen, then we're going to make this glucose sugar water and sulfur molecules. Cyanobacteria go through the process of photosynthesis where it uses sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water to make that glucose and oxygen. But together, even though these guys, they function very differently through photosynthesis and chemosynthesis, producers get their energy through these non-living sources. And that's what these guys all have in common, is that they're using non-living sources of energy to make glucose, these sugars. Now, consumers, they're going to get their energy by eating other consumers and, of course, producers. So consumers eat other organisms to get their energy, and then they break down the macromolecules that are inside of them to release that ATP in a process called cellular respiration, if you remember. There's different types of consumers. We have herbivores, which those eat only vegetables. And then we have carnivores, and those are our meat eaters. They only eat meat. And then we have omnivores. Omnivores eat both meat and vegetation. But all of these guys, all of these types of consumers, they're getting their energy by eating another organism. They're not able to photosynthesize or chemosynthesize, if you will. The energy flow and action video will be listed separately. Food chains trace a single flow of energy through different trophic levels. Those are levels of nourishment in a food chain. The arrow in a food chain is pointing towards the transfer of energy. So grass is going to transfer its energy to grasshoppers because grasshoppers eat grass. And then the grasshopper is going to transfer its energy to the mouse to the owl. That's how the food chain diagrams work. There's a rule of 10 when we talk about trophic diagrams or energy passing on from one to the next. As energy flows from an organism to an organism, a lot of it's used for metabolism and it's lost or converted to heat. Because of this, the next level of the organism chain only receives 10% of the energy that was produced from the previous level. So that other 90% is just lost. So to give this some sort of numerical value, let's just say we get 1 million joules from the sun. There's my sun. I'm getting 1 million joules from it. My producer right here, my grass, is going to get 10,000 joules, that's a J, from the sun. And only 10% of that energy is going to transfer to the grasshopper when the grasshopper eats it. So the grasshopper is going to get 1,000 joules. And when the mouse eats the grasshopper, you guessed it, it's going to absorb 100 joules. And then the owl who eats the mouse is going to get 10 joules. So that's why the owl, he has to eat a lot because he's not getting as much energy as someone who's eating lower on the food chain. Trophic levels and energy flow also will come with naming these consumers in the diagram. So anybody that gets energy from the sun is called a producer. Primary consumers, they get energy from producers. So anybody who the arrow from the producer is pointing to is considered a primary consumer, like the grasshopper, also known as herbivores. Anybody who eats these primary consumers is called a secondary consumer, and then someone who eats secondary consumers is called a tertiary consumer. In a food web, we show multiple connections all at once, and this better shows how a ecosystem is interconnected and how we transfer energy from a producer to everybody else. So if the arrow's leading from a producer, they are primary consumers. And so even in this diagram, this guy is a primary consumer, but he also eats primary consumers, so it's also a secondary consumer. The bird is going to eat primary consumers, so he's a secondary consumer. And anybody who consumes secondary consumers is a tertiary consumer. So trophic pyramids, those are models that show how energy flows through the ecosystem. There's really a couple of different kinds. There's an energy pyramid that represents all the energy that's available at each trophic level, and it always gets smaller as you go to the top. That's why we call it a pyramid. Remember, we just said that it's a rule of 10%. Then there's this numbers pyramid that represents the numbers of organisms that are at each trophic level. Since energy decreases as you go up the pyramid, there's usually fewer organisms that can be supported at the top. And then there's biomass pyramid that represents the total amount of mass of living organic matter at each trophic level. So if we were to take the tropical, rainforest and shove it all into a diagram, everything that is a primary producer, we could, essentially burn it and weigh it. We would get a mass of its material, and that's usually how we would get like a biomass, in particular. So we can show the levels of energy in different ways, whether we show it as an energy transfer, as a quantity number representative, or just mass of the stuff that's there. Here's a good example of a typical trophic pyramid where the trophic levels are labeled in numbers. The labeled in purple are the trophic level names, and the percentages of energy that's available from the previous level is located in blue. So we see that there are 4 trophic levels numbered here, and it's represented by 4 different names: the producer at the bottom, primary, and then followed by secondary and tertiary consumers. We see examples of organisms that are in each trophic level. The grass would be at the bottom, and then following our same food chain example, a grasshopper that eats grass, and a mouse that eats a grasshopper, and owls that eat mice. And then you can see the percentages of energy that's available. So if we talk about the grass as a percentage instead of actual energy, like in joules, the grass has 100% of the energy that's available to the ecosystem. And when the grass eats it, it gets 10% of that energy. And then when the mouse eats the grasshopper, it's got 1% of the energy available, followed by the owl, who will only get about 1/10 of it.